Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to the January 23, 2020 meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council. I'll be opening the meeting. We'll be adjourning to closed session. And when we return, we'll reestablish a quorum. We expect to return about 10:30-ish. Thank you. Good morning. We are reconvening from closed session. No action was taken during closed session. Let's reestablish a quorum, starting with Ken on my right.
Weinberg, present.
Gatto's present.
Stambra present.
Moranian present.
Fiorini here.
Tatayan here.
Villegas here.
And we have a quorum. Okay, on to agenda item 6, adoption of the December 19 meeting summary. Council, any discussion of the meeting summary?
Move adoption.
Move approval.
Okay. Moved by Moranian, second by Gatto, I think. Ken was third. Anyway.
Yes, I was there.
Let's take a vote.
Weinberg, aye.
Gatto, aye.
Stambra line.
Moranian, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Tatayan, aye.
Villegas, aye.
Okay, meeting summary adopted. On to agenda item 7, Chair's Report. I'd like to announce that on January 3, the state team released the 2020 water resilience portfolio that was called for in the governor's executive order N1019. And comments are due by February 7th. And I think we'll be hearing more about our efforts on the portfolio from Ryan Stambra later in the meeting. And the only other item I want to bring up at this point is I participated in an excellent webinar yesterday. Eric Kuhn and John Fleck, who co-authored a book, How Ignoring Inconvenient Science Drained the Colorado River. It was a fabulous, very informative and educational webinar, and what I took away from it is that it is really important to listen to a scientist who is warning you about a potential deficit. And so back in 1916, a USGS scientist named E.C. LaRue did some early research on the Colorado River, and he estimated demands, and these demands were based on irrigable lands. And back in those days, the term conservation meant storage. And according to the authors, in a report called Colorado River and its Utilization Water Supply, paper 395, LaRue had already concluded that there's not enough water in the river to meet future demands. And so fast forward to the situation on Colorado today. And so I'm just taken by the concept that a scientist was attempting to inform policy, but given the demands of the day and the desire to grow and other factors, his warnings were not heeded. And so now we have what the authors are calling a structural deficit of 1.2 million acre feet on the Colorado. I think it's more than that, but that was indicated in LaRue's report. So Thank goodness that we have scientists. And that's it for me. Does anyone else want to share anything during the chair's report? Well, then, that concludes the chair's report. On to agenda item 8, executive officer's report.
Thank you. Good morning. Happy New Year. I hope everyone had a refreshing holiday. I'll start with a reminder that the public draft, review draft of the Delta Plan's Ecosystem Restoration Chapter Amendment was released for a 60-day public comment period, which ended this past Tuesday, January 21st. The council has received at least a dozen detailed comment letters thus far from a range of stakeholders, and we've also been holding briefings, including briefings this month for the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, the state water contractors, and Solano County. The text of the amendment, along with its technical appendices, is all on the council's website, and as for next steps, we'll be carefully reviewing the comments and initiating the CEQA process for the chapter in the coming months. The council also sent 2 comment letters this past month among the active projects list in your binder. On December 20th, the council sent a letter to the Yolo County Department of Community Services regarding the draft EIR for their cannabis land use ordinance. And we also sent a letter to the Department of Water Resources regarding the draft EIR for the long-term operation of the State Water Project, which proposes future operations of that project. The letter encouraged DWR to engage with the council staff as the final environmental impact report is completed, and the council previously submitted a letter to DWR on the project's NOP. The public review period for the Contra Costa Flood Control District's certification of Delta Plan consistency for their Lower Marsh Creek Restoration Program concluded on December 30th with no appeals filed. And I'd like to announce that we have 2 new council employees. Firstly, Lynn Takata joins us as a senior environmental scientist in the Delta Science Program. She will lead the council's science communication efforts. She comes from the Department of Fish and Wildlife and worked on the Interagency Ecological Program on their communication efforts, as well as planning for their annual workshop. And so we're excited to have her on board to help us continue to focus and improve our science communication efforts. And for our second hire, I'm going to pass the baton to Bethany, who can introduce our new law intern as part of her legal update.
Thank you, Jessica. Members, I'd like to invite Dan Cacciatore up to the microphone. He's going to give you a legal update on a CEQA case we've been tracking for you for several years. Dan comes to us from McGeorge School of Law, where he's a third-year law student. So this is his last semester before taking the bar exam. Welcome, Dan.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Tatayan, Bethany, council members. As indicated, I'm here to provide a legal update on a litigation matter first presented to the council back in 2016. The County of San Joaquin and Contra Costa County, together with Food and Water Watch and the Planning Conservation League, filed suit against the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California in San Joaquin County Superior Court. In March of 2016, Met approved the purchase of land and filed a notice of exemption, claiming that CEQA did not apply to their purchase. In April of 2016, petitioners filed suit and asked that the trial court enjoin Met's $175,000 purchase of 5 islands, encompassing over 20,000 acres of land in the southern delta. They further requested that the court rescind the CEQA exemption and require that an EIR be prepared analyzing the potential impacts of the purchase as well as the proposed uses of the land. They argued that the purchase committed Met to a definitive course of action, which definitively would, a definitive course of action which would result in significant physical changes and environmental impacts. Previous owner, Delta Wetlands, a subsidiary of Zurich Insurance, had used lands to construct habitat restorations and water storage projects. Met had indicated several potential uses for the land, including construction of tunnels for water fix, habitat restoration, environmental mitigation, water storage projects, as well as several other environmental uses. However, Met has not committed itself to any particular use. In July of 2016, the trial court denied the injunction, finding that the purchase was not connected to a project under CEQA because the purchase had no future developmental plans. In its final opinion, issued in May of 2018, the trial court concluded that the sale was exempt from CEQA, because the purchase had no potential of impacting the environment. Similarly, on December 30th of 2019, the 3rd District Court of Appeals found that nothing in the record committed nor precluded MET from one particular use. In fact, the varied uses were so indefinite and unforeseeable that the appellate court concluded an EIR at this stage would be so speculative and premature that it would be virtually meaningless, thereby affirming the trial court's opinion and approving MET's purchase. Thank you for your time and consideration. I will now take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Very well done.
Very well
Actually-
done. Ken?
Yeah, so because there was no development plan, you know, the plaintiffs were saying you were subject to CEQA because, what was their argument?
Essentially, they were saying that the purchase committed MET to a definitive course of action that would lead to a significant environmental impact. I believe that what they were understanding is that MET had an idea of why they were purchasing the islands in the first place, and that this was going to lead to a significant environmental impact, which would invoke CEQA. But the court found that we weren't at the stage where a project has actually been determined, and at that stage, CEQA will be required.
Because it was completely speculative
Yes,
on
sir.
what they could do.
That's correct.
Gee, makes sense. What do you know?
One quick question.
ma'am.
Is it, what is the precedent of just because somebody purchases land to bring a suit? I mean, I'm thinking that generally every time this is going to happen, just because it is so unclear why people would buy land and, you know, how speculative an EIR will be, or.
Right, so CEQA is, it's kind of a balancing. You have to balance the timing with the resources, so it's a tricky balance between the two. The precedent that they relied on was a case Sierra Railroad, and even in that case, there was a sale of historic railroad to a tribe who made its intentions known to develop the property, and that sale was still not considered a project under CEQA.
Got it.
Thank you, Dan. Great job.
Thank you.
This was his first few weeks at the council, and he was ready to go, so you did a great job.
No shortage of litigation to summarize for you. Next, I'd like to invite up Ryan Stambra to provide a legislative update. And welcome back, Ryan.
Good morning, Chair Tatayan, council members. It is a pleasure to be back before you. As Chair Tatayan mentioned in her chair's report, January saw the release of the draft water resilience portfolio, which was developed in response to Governor Newsom's executive order that called for a series of actions to ensure the long-term resilience of the state's water and ecosystem resources. Currently, the draft portfolio is a suite of recommended actions supported by a region-by-region assessment to help California cope with more extreme droughts and floods, rising temperatures, declining fish populations, aging infrastructure, and other similar anticipated challenges. In the draft, the council is tasked with a few actions: ensuring the completion of its climate vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy, working with the Department of Water Resources to add a requirement to urban and agricultural water management plans, mandating how water districts are reducing their reliance on the Delta, and participating in the development of a task force to prioritize key scientific questions relating to water resilience. Other items of interest as it relates to the Delta include using the Delta Independent Science Board's monitoring review recommendations to improve Delta monitoring efforts, whose data often serve as the foundation to support real-time decision-making in the Delta and furthering adaptive management efforts, completing the update to the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and implementing that plan potentially through voluntary agreements. And the third item worth highlighting is providing incentives and technical advice to Delta landowners for creating managed wetlands or cultivating rice to reverse subsidence and reduce carbon emissions. That's something, obviously, I think you've heard Campbell from the Delta Conservancy speak about quite often. The deadline for public comment on the draft portfolio is February the 7th, and staff will certainly keep you apprised of developments moving forward. Moving on to the budget, where January 10th, Governor Newsom introduced his budget for the upcoming fiscal year. As part of his $222 billion budget are a number of proposals relating to homelessness, education, healthcare access, and the environment, with a particular emphasis on climate vulnerability and resilience. Specifically, the climate portion of the budget includes $12.5 billion over the next 5 years and is comprised of 3 key areas: a proposed $4.75 billion climate resilience bond, the creation of a $1 billion climate catalyst fund that would be capitalized over 4 years, and a $965 million cap and trade expenditure plan. Other relevant adjustments include $138 million in one-time and ongoing funds to implement the water resilience portfolio, and $66 million for urban and flood risk reduction projects aimed at modernizing operations for fish, wildlife, and habitat protection. Additionally, the budget includes a proposed staff augmentation for the council to carry out the priorities of this organization and follow through on many of the actions approved by this body through the 5-year review of the Delta Plan. The proposed new resources include 5 new positions to support our work on restoration and climate adaptation project development, early consultation for covered action projects, science synthesis, and administrative support for the processing of research contracts. Overall, this request would result in a council budget for the upcoming fiscal year of $28.5 million and 69 positions. In the coming months, council staff will continue meeting with budget committee staff in anticipation of hearings in the early spring. And then finally, turning to the legislative calendar, where January 6th marked the beginning of the legislative session, the second year of the legislative session, and with bill introduction deadline set for the 3rd week of February, I anticipate having a more detailed report for you on the outlook for the legislative year as part of my February report. And Madam Chair, that concludes my report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Any questions for Ryan? Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. In terms of items C, D, and E under the executive officer's report, you've got your monthly outreach highlights, our regularly recurring monthly active projects list, and then quarterly, at your request, we've been providing a contract and budget update. So should you have any questions on those items, we're happy to address them, but I don't plan to go over them in detail. And unless there are any questions at this point, I'll move on to item F, which is a request for your approval of a contract amendment.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments on 7 on the active projects list. It would be helpful to know what's kind of been added since the last month. And I saw you had some coding on the contract list that kind of said, I think it was some kind of date stuff, but just something like new agreements within the last 90 days, just something that tells us that the list is growing, you know, or things have dropped off, that kind of thing, because it.
Yep, great idea, we can do that.
I think that would be helpful. And then, just on the contracts, wondering whether also sorting it within a range of costs would be helpful to understand, you know, just sort of the large dollar, you know, above $1 million, you know, 100 to 500, 500 to 999, below that, just so, you know, it's a little clearer and we can kind of understand that.
Can certainly do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to sub-item F here. This item is to request to amend an existing contract with the University of California, San Diego, part of their California Sea Grant program, for a scope change only to include recruitment activities for a social scientist who's going to work with the council to develop and implement a social science research program for the Delta. This is an outcome of the social science task force that has been working at the council's behest. And this proposed amendment requires council authorization because the total contract amount exceeds my designated contract authority. I've got lead scientist John Calloway here who can answer any questions for you, or John, if you'd like to say anything more at this point. Or Louise, Conrad. I'm happy to answer questions. I think you covered it pretty well, Jake.
Any questions?
Just one question. Is this like an ongoing or, I'm trying to understand the nature of the contract in terms of sole source, ongoing, time and, flat, not to exceed?
Deputy Executive Officer for Science, Louise Conrad, joining us at the
Knows
table.
all those details.
Thank you. Good morning. Is this on? Yes. The contract currently covers 3 years of Delta Science Fellows and 2 years of the State Policy Fellows. It's all administered by the Sea Grant program that is housed in the University of California. So this is solely a scope change to allow for money that's already encumbered to cover recruitment activities for this new position.
So it's only an amendment on the scope, not to the time in,
No, not an amendment on
not to
time or
schedule and
cost.
budget? Yeah, okay.
Right.
Thank you.
The idea is that we promptly address some of the recommendations we're receiving from the Social Science Task Force, which you'll hear more about later on in the agenda.
But you will come back, I mean, this is recruit, and then there'll be some additional action or cost because you're going to recruit a person to,
Right, very good point. So this covers recruitment, but we do need to execute a new agreement that would cover the salary for this person who would be housed at the council. We are scoping a co-sponsored position between Sea Grant and the council.
which would focus, to have somebody, an individual that's really focused on the social science end, because
Exactly.
that's not
exactly.
what biologists do.
Right, and to integrate that social science work with the already very well-established natural science landscape that we have.
I'll just add, a Sea Grant extension specialist is a common position at Sea Grant where they work just like ag extension people to transfer the science to the community and the users. And so would be someone specifically focused on social science. And Sea Grant, along with us, is much more aware and engaged on social science issues and sees the value of setting up a position specifically on social science. And Louise, when the job announcement is being prepared, right? It's going to go out.
It's being prepared now and will be live early this year.
And this helps the council carry out both initiatives in the science action agenda, the Delta Science Plan, and responsive to the recommendations we received from the Independent Science Board to beef up our addressing of the human dimension of science in the natural resource landscape.
So move the staff recommendation?
Hang on just a bit. Is there any public comment on this item? No? Okay. Now, okay.
Now, motion to approve the staff recommendation.
Motion by Weinberg, second by Damrell. All right, ready, take the vote. Ken?
Weinberg, aye?
Gatto, aye.
Cameron,
Marani and I?
Fiorini, aye.
Atai and I.
Yeagas, aye.
So this action item is approved.
Thank you. Okay, moving on promptly to sub-item G, the 2019 accomplishments and proposed 2020-2021 work plan priorities. I'm excited to present today the Council's 2019 annual report, hot off the presses. This should be in your supplementary binder packet in front of you, also copies available on the public document table. This is a more detailed companion piece to our recently released 5-year review highlights report from last year. This document includes the Council's accomplishments and highlights progress on major initiatives over the past year. This progress, together with lessons learned from the 5-year review, establishes the foundation upon which the Council's draft 2020 to 2021 priorities are built. The proposed priorities for the next 2 fiscal years are intended to guide work planning for our agency. The projects and activities herein are drawn from conversations with you, council members, throughout the last year, and they reflect direction that you provided to staff at 2 council retreats in March and October of 2019. And they also put into action recommendations out of major reports like the Delta Science Plan and the 5-year review of the Delta Plan. So I've invited Chief Deputy Jessica Law up to the table, along with Deputy for Planning Jeff Henderson and Deputy for Science Louise Conrad. Jessica is going to provide an overview of the content in the 2 documents, and then senior staff and your lead scientist at my left are available to offer comments and answer any detailed questions that you might have. Jessica?
All right, thank you. Good morning, council members. We're happy to be here. It's a good way to kick off the new year by talking about priorities for not just the upcoming year, but also for 2021, which for me still sounds like the future. I can't believe we're in 2020. So here we are. We've been doing a lot of thinking and looking and talking within the organization about what our current workload is, where our priorities are, and your feedback on that has been really critical, and really where our core functions are and how we continue to grow as an organization. So we'll talk through that today. One of the main documents that I'm going to continue to reference throughout is this milestone schedule, which you all have in your binders. It goes along with the staff report. The text is absolutely way too small to really see on the screen. So if you have any questions, we'll be referring back to this. I think there's a PowerPoint presentation. Wait for that. All right, so here we are, 2020 to 2021. The annual report is always a really nice look back at what we've done over the last year and sets us up, I think, with a good framework for what is possible to accomplish over the next few years. The council retreats that we had, the 2 retreats that we had last year, both in the spring and the fall, also provided staff with a really important feedback and direction on where to go and where to focus. So just as a reminder, what the major outcomes were from those 2 retreats last year, to really better utilize DPIC as a forum and a tool to accomplish the council's goals, to prioritize and update and strengthen the agency's communication strategy, and ensure our activities are clearly broadcast, to better understand how science is informing actions and improve the Delta to support decision-making, and then also continuing the work that we have on major council commitments like the Delta Levy Investment Strategy, the Ecosystem Amendment to the Delta Plan, the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment, and of course the commitments coming out of the 5-year review of the Delta Plan and the Delta Science Plan. So these are not just priorities that we talked about at the retreats, but hopefully they're themes that you've heard throughout last year and will continue to hear through the meetings over the next 2 years as we work through this work plan. When we think about council activities, we think about it sort of in 3 ways. Core functions, this is the bread and butter of what we do, the everyday functions to keep the organization moving forward. Existing commitments that we have, and we just talked through that short list of existing commitments now, and then projected work that will appear as we move forward. Just briefly, council core functions, this is how we think about it in terms of organization. We have the major divisions between planning, science, administration, and then of course executive. And the functions and the organization, the actual structure of the organization is aligned with these core functions. In terms of council priorities for 2020 to 2021, these encompass both existing commitments and projected work, and we've organized them around 3 main objectives. 1, to strengthen and implement the Delta Plan. 2, build capacity for One Delta, One Science. And 3, enhance council leadership and communications. So the core functions are reflected in these priorities as well. So again, referencing back to this chart that you have, and we can walk through it sort of objective by objective. I'm happy to just go through the short list, but if you have any questions about any of these items, please just stop me and we can have a conversation about what's in there. So the first main objective is strengthen and implement the Delta Plan. The work that we did last year on reviewing, doing the 5-year review of the Delta Plan has really set us up well for the next few years to implement a few of the recommendations that were in there. As well, continued work on the Delta Levies investment strategy, the Delta Plan ecosystem, which Jessica talked about earlier, and the progress that we're making on that. And of course, the Delta Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Strategy is a really important project where we're pulling together information that hasn't been pulled together. Are there any questions about any of these items or the schedule over the next 2 years before I move on?
I think it's a good opportunity to just highlight the kind of extreme uncertainty associated with the covered actions line item that's kind of sleepily lying here at the bottom. As we know, that workload for the council is entirely driven by project proponents, and there's little control that unfortunately we can exercise over that. Of course, we want to stand ready at any given time to provide any assistance or early consultation that people request, which can sometimes divert us off of key projects, but that is something that we will maintain a conversation with you about throughout the implementation of this work plan so that you're fully informed and can help us if we need to make major decisions in time and resource allocation.
Okay, I'll move on. In terms of building capacity for One Delta, One Science, again, last year we really set a strong foundation for continuing on a lot of these initiatives. The Science Action Agenda, the last one was developed in 2017 and goes to 2021. This is really the basis for the competitive solicitations that we did last year, and hopefully we'll do a future one very soon. That document is time limited, and so we will begin in the next 2 years starting to work on the next round of it, 2022 to 2025. There's a lot of work that goes into that, a lot of stakeholder outreach, working with state, federal, local agencies, academia, and there's activities that are associated with that. Science funding and governance initiative, this is work that's really coming from DPIC out of a long series of efforts to really better understand governance and funding for science in the system. There is a science needs assessment workshop that is coming up this spring that will both tie this effort and the Science Action Agenda together, and will really start the conversation moving forward. And if there are any other questions about that, we're happy to answer those. Implementation of the Delta Science Plan. The Delta Science Plan is not just our plan for the science community, it's everyone's plan for the science community. And so while there are actions in there that are our own, a lot of that work is very collaborative work in bringing groups together. So for example, the Delta Agency Science Work Group, which is a meets regularly to support DPIC. That group is really helpful and supportive of actions in the Delta Science Plan. And then also funding for critical science investigations. The competitive solicitation that we put out last year is really a major milestone for the science community. And so we are doing planning and looking at the funding that we have, working with partners to try and develop an additional competitive solicitation over the next few years.
On the science workshop, who will be invited?
That's a great question. I'm going to invite Amanda Bola up, actually, if I may, to provide some more detail about that.
Hi, good morning. So the Science Needs Assessment Workshop, as Jessica mentioned, is an outgrowth of the Science Funding and Governance Initiative, and something that the Delta ISB, in their review of the initiative white paper and the updated Delta Science Plan, felt was really important to kind of round out our Delta Science strategy. And so the workshop, we're still kind of fine-tuning the audience, but we would really like it to be a mix of, scientists, policymakers, managers, kind of the folks that we invited to the Science Enterprise Workshop in 2016, so that we can really get kind of a broader understanding of what managers and decision makers feel they're going to need to know looking into the future, and so that scientists can hear that, and that they can also then help in identifying what type of science needs to be happening in response to policymakers and the decisions that need to be made.
The purpose there being trying to be more intentional about the science we're producing and the science that provides the information that decision makers need to operate in this system. And this is really also an outgrowth of responsiveness to a letter that the Independent Science Board sent to all the DPIC agencies, saying that while they like and appreciate the Delta Science Plan and it's very useful, that we also need to be looking at how to deal with a rapidly changing environment and how do we build a science enterprise in the future that's anticipating those kinds of changes and can adapt to those kinds of changes.
Don't go anywhere yet.
Ken.
Yeah, just trying to understand. So the Science Needs Assessment Workshop is going to be, who are the attendees? Is that to try and get the DPIC members that, will provide input onto their priorities for science, which is going to help them make decisions? Or is it what they want us, the Delta Science Program housed here to be doing? What's kind of the goal out of that?
It's kind of a combination of the two, but really I would say more the former. It's really kind of pulling everybody together to identify, we're going to start the workshop with kind of identifying and talking about what it is we feel like we know right now about the future, and then try and identify what do we think we need to know about the future that we don't know yet, and then to identify the science that needs to happen to answer those questions. So that's why it's going to be kind of a mix of both the scientists and the policymakers so that we have an understanding of what those questions are, so then we know what type of science to do to answer those questions. But looking out into the future, like the Science Action Agenda does that for the currently, but really looking out longer term so that we can build a resilient Delta, we need to be looking farther afield so that we can prepare ourselves as a science enterprise to be able to answer those questions.
And I'll just add, I think, thinking like was just mentioned with the science plan was developed by the science program, but it's the science plan for the whole Delta community. Similarly, the science program and the council will be leading this effort to develop, along with the independent science board, leading the effort to be thinking about more forward-looking science, but not just for us, for the broader science community. And science that, as always, will have a strong management connection and a link to management. So as Amanda mentioned, it'll be a mix of scientists and managers and decision makers.
So it looks like from this that the major deliverable is a science tracker. And what is that?
No, that's a separate issue. So the major deliverable is a science needs assessment, is an identification of what the science needs are to address challenging future management issues. The science tracker is a separate project.
Subset of that.
But it does support kind of the broader priorities of the Science Funding and Governance Initiative recommendations. So that's why you kind of see it in line with.
So the outcome, you have the workshop, and the outcome is going to be
The actual
a report?
Yes, yeah.
And that report, is that going to influence changes to the Delta Science Plan?
I think it will not, it will build on the science plan. So I think as the ISB's input, the Independent Science Board's input was, the science plan is a great document dealing with current challenges, but we need to be thinking longer term. And so this will really be complement the current. It won't replace, it will complement the current science plan. And the plan is, I think, that it will be presented to DPIC so that we get broad engagement and endorsement across all of the state and federal agencies.
Randy, you've spoken in the past, and you've sort of organized this subcommittee because they were dealing with funding and governance issues. So is that, how does the assessment feed into your going back and looking at that? Or?
Yeah, I think the Independent Science Board was concerned that a lot of the requests that come to them are immediate needs. What do we do now? And a lot of these conditions are based on years of trends. And what they want to do with the science needs assessment is to get ahead of that curve, anticipating climate change, sea level rise, things like that. Let's anticipate what are the issues that these are going to be driving 10, 20 years from now, and not constantly be in a fire drill to address the outcome of those kinds of trends. So this workshop will be very helpful in setting priorities for the future, which will guide where funding should be applied. Yeah. And the whole purpose of the Science Funding Initiative that became the Science Funding and Governance Initiative was to identify dependable, long-term, reliable sources of funding for projects that require multiple years of study and assessment. So this, the Science Needs Assessment is going to help set the agenda for the next 10 to 20 years of where we prioritize science. And the science action agenda, that's the near term. That's the next 4 or 5 years. Historically, that's what our focus has been, and the Independent Science Board says, there's so many changes. We need to be looking down the road a lot further.
And we realized that once we started the Science Funding and Governance Initiative conversations, that it wasn't as simple as just going and asking for more science funding, that there were a number of things that we had to do first. And this is one of those things that we identified that we need to do before we can really start looking at how we increase funding for science in the Delta.
Because we have to be able to fund the long-term needs, but we're also going to be putting fires out.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to do both.
Yeah,
That's
no,
our challenge, is to keep doing both. And I think also it's important to note that the needs assessment is one of the priority action items from the whole funding and governance initiative. And the other ones are moving forward. I think we're making lots of progress on the template that the Bureau has been leading the effort on to get a better understanding of current funding. So all those other aspects are moving forward. And we're very much engaged.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be helpful to understand sort of that train of logic and just kind of what the drivers are. And so if you
We're happy
go
to
back-
walk that out.
Because it wasn't clear to me, it looked like this was linear and the whole, everything was, the deliverable was the science tracker. Because you still
Sequential,
have
I was
the
wondering
governance
if this, the relevance of this, but because it also is in our other goals, I am wondering if the list of attendees and invitees could be expanded to go beyond the DPIC people? Just in the light of everything that is going on, the resiliency plan is out, and all these different entities that are in water statewide are holding all these forums and stuff, and then somehow I'm feeling like, there could be a big relevance there of us expanding this list.
Absolutely, and actually,
Statewide.
and they are actually, both the participants in the Science Funding and Governance Initiative were not just the DPIC agencies, but also water users and NGOs, and those stakeholders are also going to be invited and are included in the
And
Science
the
Needs Assessment
stakeholders
Workshop.
outside the Delta,
Yes,
but statewide.
absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other question on this section? Okay. Amanda, if you hang out, because we're going on to the next section, which is enhancing council leadership and communications. And of course, the work of DPIC is really central to this. The meetings are listed here, and we're happy to talk a little bit more about the planning process around those, but it is an iterative process that's really meant to reflect the current priorities and bring together a public discussion of what's happening in the Delta and how the existing state and federal agencies and local agencies that are on DPIC are coordinating. So we can talk more about that. Obviously, the Science Funding and Governance Initiative is a main priority. Themes around restoration, invasive species are all sort of likely topics over the coming year. Communication strategy and public participation plan. Pretty quickly, we'll be talking about a public participation plan at the council meeting next month. And this has been an ongoing effort to better clarify the council's activities and work with the public and where the public can expect to engage with us, what resources, tools we have to better carry out our work with engagement with the public. So we'll be talking more about that in February. And of course, we are continuing to work on a communication strategy. The feedback and discussion that we had at the October retreat is really helping inform that, and we'll be coming back with a little bit more information about what's in there in terms of messaging framework and really sort of where we're going to emphasize the council's work. So more to come on that. And then at the bottom of the list, that category, other activities, is intended to be broad, but we have a pretty full calendar of events and activities that are going on. These are really just a few of the highlights over the next 2 years. Of course, there's a lot that happens in between then. So if there's any questions about that, any of those events, I'm happy to answer them. Oscar.
Just a quick comment. First of all, thank you for the updates. I think the first two are pretty clear in terms of our sort of requisite mandates. And the strengthening leadership and communications was one that I think we spent a lot of time on. I know it surfaced, for me at least, when in part I think Councilmember Maranian brought up the idea of how to, those critical items that we're working on and how to communicate those with the public when we're asked about kind of the core central role of this body. And so I'm excited about that. I think staff's memo, and I think Jessica's memo, the second page, the January 16th memo, really describes for me, in part, kind of the essential, kind of the core aspects of this strategy in terms of how we're communicating with other agencies, with the public, what those tools would look like, and what are the things that people can, how do they digest the information that we're processing here and the decisions that we're making. So I think I'm looking forward to kind of seeing what that looks like, because I think it does lend itself nicely to being a good steward of the work and also communicating it with the public. So I'm excited about that
Thanks.
item.
Okay,
Yes, I am too.
good. And that's the end of the presentation, unless there are any other questions. And of course, we'll continue to update the council on progress on all of these. We, in the past, have done sort of a mid-year update in July. And of course, all of our council agenda items are really reflective of these priorities that you see. So this certainly is not the last conversation we'll have about progress over the next few years.
Great.
All right, thanks.
Excellent.
Is there any public comment on this item?
Microphone on.
Thank you. Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm OSHA Meserve. I'm here for local agencies of the North Delta. Listening to I'm glad that you guys are working on priorities. I think in terms of the communication piece, and I was listening also to the discussion of the hiring of a Sea Grant person to really help on the social aspects of it. I just think you'll want to put that together, because as somebody out here in, the Delta water and land use world, I really don't think the local public or probably statewide public is really very aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it and how it relates to the things they're doing. And there's a lot of work to be done, so I appreciate that you've recognized that. I probably haven't tracked everything you're doing on the social aspect of the science program, but the parts I have seen really don't seem to make a very big effort to connect with the Delta communities. And so I think there were experts brought in from outside our area and who, as far as I know, didn't make efforts to try to connect with the communities and what's really important socially here in the Delta. So I would just urge you to do more with that. And again, I may not know everything you've done. I know I don't know. So, but I also just was kind of perusing like the budget report, and I just don't see really any funds being put into that either. So I think the Sea Grant thing is a good part of that. But be aware, the person that you guys select for that position, I really hope that you will urge them that the way to understand the social aspects will be to interface with the community, and you're going to have to go where they are, right? People are meeting out, okay? There are so many things going on, and you can see that here, right? So it's, your people will need to go out into the community to find out the things that are important socially and try to integrate that back into the program. And I think that's how, restoration projects can deal with offsite impacts, and how a lot of good things can happen that will move things forward that we all agree are important in the Delta. But just staying here in Sacramento and having people out of state and just kind of, taking a academic approach will not work. Thank you.
I'll just thank you for your comments, Osha, and I'll just add some context. So the Social Science Task Force, you're going to hear from Rachel in just a minute or after lunch more about the Social Science Task Force. But it's important to note the Social Science Task Force was not charged with doing social science work and going out and doing that kind of work. They were academics, or they are academics, and they were tasked with helping to identify how we can do that work more effectively into the future. And they are very much aware of those sorts of issues of engaging the public. They did have 2 public meetings that were broadly announced. One, and we got a lot of input from agency representatives and encouraged anyone to participate. I think once we have the position in place with the extension specialist, definitely they will be aware of those issues and engage with the community as well as all of the agencies and others. And then also I would encourage you, OSHA, that to look at the Social Science Task Force reports and recommendations. It's currently out and available for public comment, and the comments are due by the end of the month. So I think the task force tried to make really explicit in their report that they were not trying to go out and do research and engage the public, but get more input on that.
Any questions or additional comments?
Now I kind of understand, because when I read the report, UC Extension, I was wondering why you were doing it, but I mean, that's what they're famous for, is they are community-based and work in the community. Randy probably, knows this through the cooperative extension. Those guys are always out working with people.
That is exactly
on
what
the
extension
ground.
specialists.
Yeah, so now it makes sense why you went that path.
Yeah, the current Sea Grant extension specialists work more with like the fishing community, and they go out to work with the fishing community to get input on the marine protected areas and other things. And it's important to realize that it's Sea Grant, it's coastal, but they are very engaged on estuarine issues as well. But they have one other social science extension specialist that they've just recently hired in another part of the state, but this will be an effort within the Delta.
Oscar.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to add on to John's comment, if I may, that as a part of the 5-year review of the Delta Plan, if you remember, there were 2 white papers that were identified, one looking at disadvantaged communities and environmental justice groups and populations, and then also looking at Delta as a place. Those are listed on the schedule for completion more towards the end of 2021, but those are white papers. There's a lot of work that goes into those, into reaching out to community groups. That's a lot of work that we're doing right now on the climate vulnerability assessment, reaching out to community-based organizations. And I think there's a lot of support also that we're seeing from other state agencies like Bcdc, who will be here later this afternoon to talk about the Adapting to Rising Tides project, where this is really sort of a central focus of planning work around the state, and is especially important within regions like the Delta. And so we understand that it's an important focus to have over the next few years, and are looking forward to talking about it more with the council and continuing to grow it.
If I can just add on to
Yes,
that. Thank you,
Oscar.
Jessica. That's actually perfect. And I wanted to underscore, at the risk of stating it again, the idea of the communication strategy, while it may seem to be something that's new, it doesn't have to be. I think there's existing platforms and other state agencies, one of which you just referenced, that we can use as a way to communicate a lot of what's happening here. So I don't feel the need that necessarily it's always going to be to reinvent that wheel. There are things happening that we can use. To that end, my colleague Supervisor Natoli, who's in the background here, who will be serving in this role, in this seat within the next year, we've talked about using the Delta Protection Commission, the Delta Stewardship Council, the Delta Conservancy, and other agencies to communicate what's happening, because as mentioned by the public testimony, it's impossible to be everywhere all the time, competing with all the other challenges that folks have with information overload. So it's not, I'm not looking for a reinvention of the wheel. There are things that we can utilize.
Thank you.
That concludes my executive officer's report. I might suggest, since we're a little ahead of time, that we could stick with an hour-long lunch break, reconvene and do the lead scientist report, and then we have our guests from BCDC joining us at 1 p.m. sharp for your consideration.
Council members, what's your preference? Yeah, that sounds.
Or later.
Jessica, I think, is suggesting that we can have the lead scientist report before the BCDC item.
Okay,
We can have it at 12:30. Then, looks like we can break for lunch and be back here at 12:30. Welcome back, everyone. Before we move on to the lead scientist report, I just wanted to share with you and my fellow council members that on January 27, there'll be a brown bag. We are in the midst of looking to hire a new lead scientist. And one part of the hiring process is that the candidates offer a brown bag. And so the brown bag on January 27 will be given by Dr. J. Lund. So if you want more information on that, it's on our website. I'm sorry I don't have the time, the start time, exact start time, but maybe John.
I don't have the exact time, but we can get it before the end of the meeting.
It's either 11:30 or noon.
It's earlier in the late morning.
So there are 4 candidates. The first has been announced. It's Dr. J. Lund, who currently serves on the Independent Science Board, and his brown bag and interview process will take place on January 27th, and then we'll announce the successive candidates after that.
There's 3 more.
Okay, on to the lead scientist report.
Great. Thank you, Chair Tatayan, and good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. For my report, I have 2 articles that I wanted to talk to you about, and then an update on the Social Science Task Force. And given the interest in the Social Science Task Force, I think we'll start with that. So I'm going to ask Rachel Klopfenstein, who's an environmental specialist in the science program and who's been coordinating the Social Science Task Force, to give you an overview. Their draft report is just out, and as you heard, is out for public comment currently. And I think from the questions that already came up, clearly there's interest in this. I think in terms of thinking about how social science can contribute, there's many different ways. One thing that I think Rachel will highlight is the diversity of fields within, and that the report highlights, is the diversity of fields within the social sciences. Everything from economics to communication to all kinds of other issues. I'll just give one quote from the report that I think highlights the value for us, and that they highlight that adaptive management is fundamentally a social decision-making process. And so we can really use social science to understand adaptive management and to improve the way we do adaptive management. So I'll turn it over to Rachel, and she has some slides to run you through the report.
Great. Thank you, John. Hello and good afternoon, council members. Again, my name is Rachel Klopfenstein. I'm an environmental scientist in the Delta Science Program. I appreciate your time, and I'm excited to give you an update on the Delta Social Science Task Force, a panel of social scientists that were convened by the Delta Science Program to provide strategic recommendations for strengthening and integrating social sciences into the science, policy, and management landscape of the Delta. The council has been given some updates over the past few years, or past year or so, regarding progress on this effort, including the interest that we've received in this project. For some time, there's been a call for better addressing the human dimensions and incorporating and integrating social and natural sciences across major aquatic systems, including here in the Delta, as well as other systems like the Chesapeake Bay and Puget Sound. And the need has been recognized in many documents and venues here in the Delta, including the Science Action Agenda and the Delta Science Plan, as well as in workshops and reviews, including one from the Independent Science Board. But despite this recognized importance, limited social science research has been conducted and funded in the Delta to date. So the Delta Science Program, in collaboration with the Coastal and Marine Sciences Institute at UC Davis, convened this panel to help tackle this issue. I'm going to give a really short, high-level overview of what's in the draft strategy report that was released by the task force last month, but I first want to define what we mean by social science. Social science is the process of describing, explaining, and predicting human behavior and institutional structures in interaction with their environments. Like the natural sciences, social sciences include a broad set of disciplines and methods that can be used to help study the Delta and inform management. For example, I have some questions up here. A psychologist might ask, what values, attitudes, and prior experiences influence farmers' adoption of a riparian stream buffer? Or an economist might ask, what are the benefits and costs of an alternative environmental restoration strategy? A human geographer might ask, how are people in the Delta affected by and adapting to climate change? Answers to these questions can provide valuable information for decision makers, especially when considering the important delta as place component of the co-equal goals. I want to briefly introduce the task force members and highlight some steps in the process. A broad range, as you can see from the 6 members, a broad range of expertise are represented on the task force, and this was informed by some early discussions that we had from key interest groups about the areas of expertise that should be represented. In addition to having a variety of expertise, the representatives on the task force are from within and outside of the Delta. The outreach process for this has been a really important component of this project. Since mid-2018, we've had multiple opportunities to engage with other groups who are interested in also this social science integration, including through public workshops, presentations, and interagency meetings. And a lot of the input along the way has helped to inform the draft strategy. So the task force, again, which we kind of discussed a little bit earlier today, they were not charged with doing social science research, but rather to provide a strategy. And there is quite a bit of focus on state agencies as well in this. The bulk of the draft report, which was released in December of 2019, focuses around 3 findings and 9 recommendations relevant to those findings. But the report also explains why social sciences are important for the Delta, and also gives an overview of what social science is, as well as what it is not, and includes helpful definitions and examples of various disciplines. So finding 1 from the task force is that research activities are ongoing, but there is no long-term vision for social science integration. So the 3 recommendations that they focus on for addressing this finding are collaborative processes to develop a conceptual framework and indicators for the Delta that includes social sciences, as well as for a process or a plan for how we're going to integrate social science information. Finding number 2 from the task force is that there's a lack of social science capacity and investment in the Delta. So their 3 recommendations for this finding are to encourage broad funding of social science, building an external network of social scientists, and building internal capacity through hiring. And earlier today, we heard about an extension specialist that the science program is considering hiring in addition to, or with California Sea Grant, which is one way that we can help to address some of the findings and the recommendations for this one. Finding number 3 is that social science does not explicitly inform adaptive management structures and processes currently in the Delta. And the 3 specific recommendations for this finding really call for evaluating and improving the role of adaptive management and learning in our management and decision-making here in the Delta. So this is just a draft report, and I just flew through what the findings and recommendations are. But moving forward, the task force is really interested in getting feedback in this process. Comments on the draft report can be sent directly to the task force members through the end of this month before they release their final draft in March of 2020. And also, I just want to note that the science program recently convened and presented on this, facilitated some discussion at recent interagency meetings, and we got a lot of really valuable insight and input from other agency staff in the last couple of weeks. Moving forward, the Delta Science Program and Council staff are thinking of next steps and opportunities to implement some of these recommendations in collaboration with other entities. And if the council members are interested in learning more, we can help to arrange a presentation from one of the task force members and authors of this report once their final draft is released. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions before I turn over to John.
Thank you, Rachel. Any questions from council members?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Rachel. I'm just curious, have you had, or are you having communications with the Delta Protection Commission?
Yeah. So last week, the Delta as Place Interagency Working Group met, and so that's a group that's been organized by Virginia Gardner at the Delta Protection Commission, and that was actually one of our first meetings that we had where people could weigh in on the draft report, and it was a really helpful discussion. But yeah, we have been having direct communication with various agencies trying to get input from specific folks who have been engaged with the effort over the last year or more.
Yeah, great report, Rachel. I've been wondering about this and looking forward to reading it. Kind of along what Supervisor Villegas said, have you reached out to the water contractors? Because it seems like if you're looking at, we're going to fund this position if we want to have, the water contractors tend to have a big role in driving science and that if they see value in the social sciences being part of the solution, it would make sense to just try and kind of convince them that this is part of overall science, so they're not just focused on, gee, I've got to answer this specific
That's a great point.
biological question or.
It turns out the State Water Contractors Organization has a scientist they stole from us, hired from here. So I think that would be a very direct way that we could reach out, although I'm sure she's already tracking this.
Yeah, we have reached out to folks from the state water contractors, and we did have a meeting last week, but I can't remember if we did have any of the state water contractor reps there, but we did have a Delta Agency Science Work Group meeting last week where we did some outreach for that. But then we did have these 2 workshops last year where there wasn't necessarily direct presentations from them, but there was some engagement. So that's still a good point. We have a couple more weeks of getting folks to read the report and hopefully providing input. For them to consider.
Or either, just so there's such a major stakeholder, especially when it comes to funding science, that you want to get them to buy in that this is on an equal footing with the physical sciences that we do.
I think we have reached out to them in the past, but that's a good reminder. We've reached out to them in the past on this particular issue, so they're very much aware that the report, or that the effort is ongoing. Whether they're aware exactly of the deadline for the comments, I'm not certain, but we'll let them.
Okay, no, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any public comments on this item? Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much. Okay, so as I mentioned, I have 2 articles that I wanted to highlight for you, and then a number of items, upcoming issues that are upcoming events to let you know about. So the 2 papers that we chose to summarize for this month relate to fish. We haven't talked about fish in a while, so I thought that we have a paper on Delta smelt and a paper on salmon, the sort of the key species that are of major interest within the Delta. But I do also want to highlight, beyond thinking about fish, some general messages I think that come out of them are, we heard about the water resiliency portfolio. I think one of the messages of these papers is the resiliency of species and the mix of approaches that species have evolved that give them some resilience to potential impacts and changes. So sort of that portfolio approach for a species is really important for both of these papers. Restoration is really critical as a way to improve the status of the species. And then the other uniting theme that I didn't even realize how important it was is that an enormous number of the authors of these papers are Delta Science Fellows, going back all the way to 2006 when the Science Fellows program was through CalFed. I'll highlight who's involved. But that's definitely relevant. The deadline for Science Fellows for the upcoming awards was just in December, and we're right now in the midst of reviewing those, and probably in March or April, we'll have decisions for the new round of Science Fellows. So the first paper is on Delta smelt, and the title is Complex Life Histories Discovered in a Critically Endangered Fish. Jim Hobbs, who was at UC Davis and now is at the Interagency Ecological Program, or the IEP, coordinating field long-term monitoring, is the lead author. Jim is a science fellow from back in 2006. Levi Lewis and Malte Wilmes are 2 co-authors that also are both Delta Science Fellows. Christian Denny is at UC Davis, and then Eva Bush was a student at UC Davis and is now a senior environmental scientist at the science program. So definitely many people that are close to home for the science program. So this paper used a technique that I've mentioned in the past, looking at otoliths, at fish ear bones that are laid down sequentially as the fish grows. And so you can look from the inside out, the oldest part of the fish, the conditions that when the fish was its youngest are in the center of the otolith, and then moving out all the way till the end of its life. And these, Jim Hobbs has really been a leader in using isotopic methods, where you look at each little individual layer and look at the isotopic composition of strontium that is highly correlated with the salinity of the water. So by looking at the isotopic conditions of each little layer, kind of like a tree ring, you can identify where the fish was spending its time over the course of, just with accuracy of weeks. Because these are fish that only live a year, and so you can follow over the whole course of the year where the fish has been. And the question was, everyone has thought of these as sort of as semi-anadromous, or a species that migrates from born in freshwater, moves to brackish water, and then goes back to freshwater to lay its eggs. And that's been the typical description of their life history, but some people have identified that there may be some individuals that spend all their time in freshwater or all their time in brackish water. So by looking at, these fish are too small to tag, so unlike salmon, you can't tag them and follow where they go. The tags would kill the fish or harm them. So this is just really an interesting technology and amazing technology to follow get more input on their life history. And so what Jim and his co-authors found was that this migratory life history is the most common. And on the slide that is shown there, that's the visual summary that Kate Melanson has put together, our Sea Grant, our state fellow. 81% of the fish are semi-anadromous or migratory. 12% spend all of their time in freshwater, and 7% spend all of their time in brackish water. The brackish water ones, there's no evidence that they actually lay their eggs in brackish water, so they may have been born in freshwater but moved at a very, very young age into brackish water and spent their whole life in brackish water conditions. So this does highlight that they do have a portfolio approach in their life history. They have a mix of different life histories that across the population. Some that are going to do better in really wet years, some that are going to do better in drier years, potentially. Obviously, the population is at really, really low numbers currently, but this does give us some insight in terms of flow is important in affecting the fish, but access to habitat and restoration, providing restoration in a mix of places is really going to provide some benefits for this fish. So those are the issues I wanted to highlight. They also do acknowledge the challenge of temperature, that even if we do, given where we're at, they're very sensitive to temperature. So even if they have good habitat, if the water temperature is high, the survival rates are very low. So clearly Delta smelt have some challenging times ahead of them, but hopefully with some improvement, with some restoration, we can improve the conditions for the population. So questions?
In terms of management questions, this is very important, because one of the key questions we have, right, is where are smelt?
Yes.
Are we measuring for them in the right places? And where do we build habitat that they can access?
Yes, definitely. And we're already, people are already responding to this. So in terms of thinking about the brackish water opportunities and opportunities in Suisun Bay, there's a number of experiments going on currently to improve conditions in Suisun Bay through the salinity control gates that are there, and improve access and conditions for fish. Any questions? Ken?
So salinity they're not as sensitive to salinity as we may have thought. Is it food, access to food, that's keeping them in, brackish or not being migratory? Is that the key driver here? Or
It's hard to say exactly why they're staying in one place or not. But it's not just, they are very salinity sensitive, but it's just that there's diversity within the population. Some individuals are moving around a lot in response to salinity. Some individuals are not.
Are less sensitive, but is the conventional wisdom that they like turbid conditions?
Yes,
Is that
so
still?
I think that's still
freshwater and turbid?
Yeah, and that's really more about, I think, predator benefits, reduced predation.
So this allows us to expand where we do restoration?
I think it does. Challenges us to think about where best to put those restoration efforts and think about a mix of conditions.
Interesting.
Any other questions? Okay, so then we'll move on to the second paper, which is on salmon, and the title is 8 Decades of Hatchery Salmon Releases in the California Central Valley, Factors Influencing Straying and Resilience. And for this paper, again, I think for salmon, you'll see for the natural populations and for the hatchery populations, having a diverse population is important for the survival of the fish. And for this paper the lead author is Anna Sturek, who is a postdoc at UC Berkeley and a Delta Science Fellow, and then a number of colleagues from UC Berkeley and from the National Marine Fisheries. So they looked at long-term records for salmon returns. They looked at going back all the way to 1940, when there were the beginnings of hatchery releases. They had data for over 2 billion fish that were released over that 8-decade period. So an enormous number of salmon are released from hatcheries. It included 5 hatcheries: the Coleman National Hatchery up on the Sacramento River, the Feather River Hatchery, the Nimbus Hatchery on the American River, the McCollum River, and the Merced River hatcheries. So they looked at the number of releases. Then for more recent periods in 2006 to 2012, they looked at straying rates of the fish that are released from different locations. Do they make it back to to their home river, or do they move somewhere else? And they want, what was really motivating this is that historically the fish were released at the hatcheries, but more recently over the last few decades, fish have been released farther downstream, and then even more recently, fish have been released into the bay. And so the question is, if you release those fish farther downstream, do they still make it back to their home body? What they found was that there is more and more straying, and that straying is correlated with where the fish are released. The farther downstream they're released, the more likely they are to go to the wrong creek or the wrong river when they're coming back. What they found for the McCollum fish was that if they're released in the bay, they're 9 times higher than fish that are released at the hatchery to stray. For the Nimbus River, they're 26 times more likely to stray if they're released in the bay. And the farther down, if you only release them slightly downriver, they're more likely to come back. If you release them down in the delta, they're more likely to stray, and then the worst conditions are in the bay. So there definitely are some trade-offs, and that's really what they're trying to highlight. Another thing that they point out is that the timing of the releases over decades has gotten narrower and narrower. There used to be smaller fish released. Now it's smolts, larger juveniles that are released, and they're released in a narrower window of time, which has some potential, in terms of resilience, has some potential negative implications in that if all the fish are getting out into the ocean at the same time, they're very susceptible to it. If there's poor conditions for a period of months with fish or high rates of predation, the whole population is potentially going to be impacted by those negative impacts. So the natural population goes down over a much longer time period, and really takes advantage of that sort of portfolio approach, so that some fish may do well under certain years and some fish may do well in others. So it's not to say, so there certainly are many benefits, significant benefits of hatcheries, but what they're really trying to highlight are these trade-offs, and that we should think about the potential negative effects of the hatchery fish on the natural populations, because if they breed with the natural populations, they're going to reduce the adaptation to local conditions within the natural population and potentially have negative impacts on the natural population. So some of the things that they highlight is that they should consider both the benefits to hatchery populations as well as to natural populations. Again, restoration is really critical. If we can improve survivorship of the natural population, then there wouldn't be, the hatchery impacts may not be so significant. Actually, what's been shown is that if there's a lot of fish moving back upstream from the natural populations, they are releasing pheromones and hormones that will help to guide the hatchery fish, so they can actually have some co-benefits there. They highlight that we might want to consider what are called terminal fisheries, releasing salmon out in isolated bays or lagoons, so that they're increasing the number of fish for recreational and for commercial fishery, but they're coming back to those local areas and not coming upstream and potentially having impacts on the native populations. So those are some of the recommendations and some of the potential impacts. And again, I think the whole idea is really that as they highlight at the end of their article, they say that there are no simple solutions, but really we should think about the trade-offs in hatchery impacts, benefits of hatchery management, as well as potential long-term impacts on the wild fall run populations. So any questions or comments, Randy?
Randy?
Well, this is relevant to the Delta Plan.
Certainly.
At the time when we adopted the Delta Plan, there was considerable interest in maintaining the wild fall run population. So we recommended mark select fisheries. We recommended hatchery management practices, and we recommended predation control. The reason they're trucking these fish is because the gauntlet of predation is, well, in the case of winter run, they trucked everything because they were afraid in the low water year that none of the winter run would survive the gauntlet of predation. So I guess if we were to grade ourselves as how effective the Delta Plan has been in achieving the goals, we'd probably get a D or an F, because our recommendations have largely gone disregarded. I think that it seems to me that we're reaching a point now where the straying has become so significant, it's hard to find wild fish genetics any longer, and it would take years to rebuild that. And so have we reached a point where hatchery management is simply being conducted to grow the fish population in support of the salmon fishing industry?
For fall run, probably.
Yeah.
But I think there still are wild runs that are available. And so I think trying to do what we can to minimize straying, do some restoration in the Delta as well as upstream, especially targeting areas where there's high levels of predation, to provide some refuge and to try to reduce predation in those hotspots might be some ways where we could achieve both. But yes, I would say these recommendations mirror many of the recommendations that were in the original Delta Plan.
Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering out loud, what can we do to add more rigor to the findings and the recommendations? And that's why I posed the question, are we giving up on the wild population or not? And if we're not, somebody's going to have to become a champion to redo the hatchery practices.
Yeah, well, I think this paper hopefully raises awareness. It's gotten a lot of good coverage, so I think it's really highlighting those exact issues, that if we are going to protect the wild runs, that we have to take seriously the implications and the impacts of the hatchery populations.
Ken?
Yeah, in the ecosystem amendment, I mean, we tried to bring out the issue of predation and restoration. And I remember Council Member Maranian brought up the hot spots, and that we needed to focus on that and how big a problem is that. And I can't remember how we dealt with it, but is the ecosystem amendment sort of a vehicle to kind of, make sure we're raising this issue and how to deal with it? Because I know we've talked about, and the science community is focused there too. It's like, we've got to do something about the salmon population,
I think this certainly should be incorporated in, the findings from this should be incorporated into the revised draft for the ecosystem amendment.
Yeah, that one, and yeah, and that's not the only
Yeah, there's
hotspot.
many
Yeah, it's just
locations.
like, the most
One of many, yes.
egregious.
Okay.
The whole taking the fish, the truck that you explained, and that totally, it's not as effective or efficient as it has to be, right, because of the hotspots. I mean, how does that come in relationship with the hotspots, and how the movement at least could be done right? Yeah.
Well, so they're trucking them to get them past those hot spots, get them past the predation impacts and farther out.
But is that really?
It works for those fish. It does. Those fish have higher survivorship, and they do make it back, but it has those negative impacts on the wild run, the native fish that are also, running that same course.
And what is the negative impact there?
So they if they end up competing with them, and then they also end up, if they interbreed with them, they remove the local adaptation that the native fish have to their particular habitats and conditions.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, John. Is there any public comment on this item? Then we'll move to agenda item 9, Bay Conservation and Development Commission's adapting.
Okay, and coming up to the table, we have Harriet Ross, Ron Melser, and Kaylee Griffith from our staff. And also, I'll let them introduce their guests from the Bay Conservation and Development Commission.
Apparently, we have a rather large panel for you today.
Of presenters.
Okay, I think I'm on deck for kicking this off. Good afternoon, council members, Chair Tatayan. Okay, so this afternoon's item is on the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. I'm going to use the acronym BCDC. They're adapting to Rising Tides program. And so let me see if I can get through some introductions. So again, council staff, Kaylee Griffin, and Assistant Planning Director Harriet Ross. I'm Ron Melser, within the Ecosystem Unit in the Planning Division at the Council. And then we also have Jessica Fain, the Planning Program Director at Bcdc, Dana Breckwald, who is the Program Manager for the Adapting to Rising Tides program, and then Samantha Cohen, Environmental Scientist and Project Manager for the work that was done. And I want to note, as you all know, that we have supported the Adapting to Rising Tides project. Maybe I can use the acronym, the ART program in Eastern Contra Costa County. And further, I think we've been a somewhat helpful partner, hopefully, in the technical work and putting the study together. So we have a couple slides where I will introduce today's item, and then I'll turn it over to the BCDC staff. And we will wrap up with a brief discussion on some of the overlap and collaboration with work that's going on here at the council. Okay, so today's discussion, again, we'll discuss the East Contra Costa County Adapting to Rising Tides, or ART, program, and the project that was conducted. But also, I wanted to take a quick step back and review the interplay between Bcdc and the Delta Stewardship Council, and then also an existing memorandum of understanding between our agencies. And so BCDC is a state agency, and similar to the Delta Stewardship Council, they have a planning group, regulatory authority, and they also have enforcement authority within their jurisdiction. Their mission is to protect and enhance the San Francisco Bay and encourage the Bay's responsible and productive use for this and future generations. The commission consists of 27 representatives of all 9 counties, state appointees, and agencies. The other aspect of BCDC's authority that's important is their Coastal Zone Management Act authority. Okay, so the Delta Reform Act and the McAteer-Petras Act state that the Stewardship Council and BCDC share planning, resource management, and climate change planning authorities in the Sassoon Marsh. This map represents our respective agencies' jurisdictional regions, and as you can see in the center of the graphic, the green hash-marked area is the Sassoon Marsh, where our authorities overlap. Given the overlap in administrative boundaries, the fact that the Sassoon Marsh is hydrologically connected to both of our jurisdictional areas and socially connected as well, it really makes sense that our agencies work closely and collaborate on issues within that region. Okay, so one more slide, just checking in on the memorandum of understanding between the Delta Stewardship Council and BCDC. So in 2011, we forged this agreement to improve coordination for the management of the Sassoon Marsh and to coordinate on issues of climate change within the San Francisco Bay and Delta. Under the MOU, the Council and BCDC are to mutually review each other's policies and processes which update those policies. BCDC is in the process of updating the Sassoon Marsh Plan, or at least initiating that update, and we are looking forward to engaging in that process. Further, the MOU directs each of our agencies to establish cohesive sea level rise policies and planning within each of our jurisdictions and within the overlap in the Sassoon Marsh. East Contra Costa Adapting to Rising Tides project and program really represents a key aspect of that coordination. And further, BCDC is reciprocally engaged in our climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy project. So both agencies convene and participate in work groups with shared stakeholders in each of these projects. And we're excited to continue to work with the BCDC staff. So at this point, I will turn it over to my colleagues and allow them to talk a little bit about their program and work within East Contra Costa.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks for that introduction. I think that was some really helpful framing for the conversation we're going to be having today. I think, and I'm Jessica Fain, I'm the planning director at BCDC. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues in a second, but just really want to say thank you because I think this project really represents what this memorandum of understanding is all about, how we can really plan across our jurisdictions and think about the Bay Delta connection. So this project is really just a great example of how our agencies can really work together and think about the interconnectedness of these systems. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dana Breckwald, who's our ART, new acronym, ART program manager to kind of kick it off.
Thank you, Jessica. So I'll just give you a little bit of a brief background on the Adapting to Rising Tides program. We're in the planning division of BCDC, and we're not tied to the regulatory side. We really, our focus is to build capacity for local jurisdictions along the Bay shoreline to respond to sea level rise through vulnerability assessment and planning for adaptation strategies. So we've done a number of projects in the East Bay in Alameda County, working with various cities and counties, and we had previously worked with Contra Costa County on the western portion of their project when this project came up. So this is a really unique project in that it's the first time we really are working outside of our jurisdiction, working with another agency, and looking at the interplay between the Bay and the Delta. We also have a number of tools online that help jurisdictions do their own work that include templates, sample agendas, how-to guides, all sorts of work like that. So our goal really is to help all of the local jurisdictions within our jurisdiction and through our work with Delta Stewardship Council along the Delta as well to be prepared for climate adaptation. So I will turn it over to Sam now, who will tell you all about the East Contra Costa project.
Thank you, Ron, Jessica, and Dana, and thank you, DSC, for funding our project. It was a great way to bridge the divide between BCDC and DSC, and we've really started to form some great relationships. So I'm going to be calling East Contra Costa County ECC today so that it's less of a mouthful. So today, I'd like you to leave with an understanding of the ART process, what is at risk in ECC through hearing about the project's key planning issues, as well as potential adaptation solutions to some of these key planning issues that are facing the region. As Dana mentioned, we've done a bunch of work around the Bay Area, as you can see in Alameda, Oakland, Hayward, and we also started the West Contra Costa County project. However, due to differences in the Delta's hydrology, we needed to do a new flood model, and I'll get into that in a second. And so we split up Contra Costa County into two sections, dividing it between where Pittsburgh starts. And as Dana said, this is unique because it's our first ART project outside of our jurisdiction. ART is also involved in ART Bay Area, which is the first region-wide analysis of sea level rise in the Bay Area. And it's just been completed, and we're going to have a public release sometime in February, so look out for that. And getting into ART ECC, this project completed a sea level rise study and adaptation planning effort to understand the vulnerabilities in the Delta through a collaborative stakeholder-driven process. The project helped inform ART Bay Area and lessons learned that we will share with DSC for your own vulnerability assessment. And the project aimed to model and map flood maps, which can be publicly viewed on our Web Explorer, as well as assess multiple assets at various scales, consider how to integrate these findings into city plans, understand the consequences of flooding, and develop adaptation responses, as well as create a strong collaboration among working group members. The working group was formed to ground truth our work, and we held 5 meetings where we presented information and gathered feedback from them. The members could then communicate these findings to their own stakeholders, and members of the working group included various county and city agencies, federal agencies such as Fish and Wildlife, regional transportation authorities, water utilities, and even just some interested citizens, among many others. So in this diagram is the ART planning process, which is a 4-step process, and we brought the working group along with us through this ART planning process. First was scope and organize, where we identified the sectors, the climate scenarios, and collective goals for the project. Second was assessing the vulnerabilities of these sectors that we defined. Third was define, where we identified the key planning issues that face the region. And then in plan, we developed adaptation solutions. So to begin the ART planning process, we defined the project area from Pittsburgh to the eastern edge of the county and down to Clifton Court Forebay, as you can see in this map. The sectors that we analyzed were agriculture, business, community engagement, critical facilities, Delta Islands, energy, natural lands, communities, stormwater, transportation, water, and wastewater. And within each of these sectors were multiple assets that we looked at. So for example, transportation, we looked at BART. Next, we had to set our sea level rise scenarios that we would model, which we based off of OPC's guidance, or Ocean Protection Council, which is seen on this image right here. The right column shows a high probability sea level rise scenario, while the middle column includes a low to extreme risk scenario. So this sea level rise range is from 12 inches to 122 inches by 2100, and this helped us pick our 4 sea level rise scenarios to use. And these scenarios were 12, 24, 36, and 83 inches. On top of these 4 scenarios, we also added a 100-year storm event. Then we created flood maps by hiring AECOM to model the flood scenarios. So this image is provided by AECOM, and it shows how 12 inches of sea level rise from the Golden Gate Bridge translates to 11 to 13 inches of sea level rise in the Delta. And this is why we needed a new flood model from the rest of the county, because due to the geometry and the way that the tides influence all the way up into the Delta, sea level rise is not a one-to-one translation from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Delta. After we scoped and organized the project, we assessed how sea level rise and 100-year storm events would affect the sectors described earlier. So now I'm going to present what we discovered during our define and plan steps of the ART planning process, which includes defining the key planning issues for the region and developing adaptation responses. Adaptation responses were developed for each of the key planning issues, as well as for vulnerabilities faced by each asset. These adaptation responses include an action or a series of actions to address the vulnerabilities, as well as implementation options, such as who should lead and partner for each response. So now getting into the key planning issues. The first key planning issue out of 7 is Shoreline Industries. Seen here is the industrial shoreline near the Antioch Bridge at 12 inches of sea level rise with a 100-year storm. The industrial and manufacturing sites on the shoreline are mostly concentrated in Pittsburgh and Antioch, and it's a major source of current and future employment for the region. These sites rely on utility networks such as water, energy, wastewater, and drainage, as well as roads that are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm events. Additionally, a major source of jobs in the region is from recreation and tourism, which requires a functioning shoreline for marinas, harbors, boats, boat rentals, and bait shops. And now for each of the key planning issues, I'm going to show you what the working group voted on as the top priority adaptation action for each key planning issue. So for Shoreline Industries, the working group voted on to form or expand existing public-private partnerships to develop a regional plan to protect or relocate the nexus of pipelines, marine terminals, roads, and rail lines that water-dependent industries rely on for continued operations. Keep in mind that as I go through these, we developed a lot of other adaptation actions, and that these were ones just that the working group thought should be prioritized. Number 2 is vulnerable communities. Shown here on the right is an ART social vulnerability ranking with 83 inches of sea level rise. And this includes the communities of Pittsburgh, Antioch, Brentwood, Byron, and Bethel Island. So there may be certain characteristics that can cause communities to be more vulnerable to flooding and may be less able to prepare for, respond to, or recover from flood events due to difficulties evacuating, finding resources, or temporary shelter. And this could possibly be due to issues with mobility, transportation, or language barriers. And some of these community members may even face permanent displacement after a flood event. Art defines socially vulnerable communities as low income, linguistically or socially isolated, without access to a car, elderly, very young, or disabled. The working group voted on the top adaptation action to support community-driven relocation out of high-hazard areas by providing funding and technical assistance, particularly to low-income households, renters, and those without vehicles. The third key planning issue is access to services. ECC lacks redundant transportation options, such as the Antioch, Bethel Island, and Jersey Island bridges, which are some of these islands' only way in or out. There are also a limited number of public facilities in this part of the county, which may result in shoreline communities becoming isolated from emergency services, healthcare, jobs, schools, grocery stores, and other critical services during flood events due to roads being blocked. Highway 4 and State Route 160 are the only major transportation arteries in this region, and they may become gridlocked during flood emergencies. There are also critical facilities that may flood in the project area, such as a fire station, police stations, retail, schools, and possibly many other services that we didn't look at in this data set, such as dentist office and post offices. The working group voted on the top adaptation action to conduct locally refined analyses to determine the sources of and potential solutions to resolve flooding that could damage critical routes for emergency response and for communities to access services. The fourth key planning issue of the region was ad hoc flood protection. Seen here is a rail line on the shoreline of Antioch. Some communities are protected from coastal flooding by rail lines, shoreline parks, and tidal wetlands. Rail lines are typically built on earthen mounds, which act as flood barriers, which you can see in the picture. Shoreline parks typically go from sea level and rise in elevation, and tidal wetlands can help reduce wave height and coastal erosion. These three things also act as the first line of defense to protect communities against storm surge or flooding. So while these built and natural areas reduce the flood risk of adjacent communities, they have not been specifically designed or maintained for this function, and therefore only provide ad hoc flood protection. The working group voted on the top adaptation action to initiate tidal wetland restorations that will protect and enhance the broad benefits they provide, including flood risk reduction, habitat, biodiversity, and water quality. The fifth key planning issue of this region is parks and open space. Shoreline parks and open space are not only the first line of defense against inland flooding, but they are themselves also vulnerable to the early impacts of sea level rise, and therefore are key early adaptation opportunity sites. However, some areas of the shoreline, such as Oakley, have a more concentrated area of shoreline parks and provide these benefits. So damage or loss of these valuable parks would have significant impacts on habitat, recreation, and the health of communities in the project area. Reduction in access to parks, open spaces, bike trails, fishing piers, and boat launches could affect some individuals and communities more adversely than others. For example, if residents rely on fishing piers for food or a bike trail to get to work. The working group voted on prioritizing the adaptation action to establish a new authority or expand an existing authority to plan, fund, manage, and maintain shoreline solutions to protect the shoreline. The sixth key planning issue out of 7 is unique to the ECC project area versus the West County, and this is about levees, reclamation, and subsidence. The map seen here shows subsidence in the project area, which is highlighted in red, and this ranges from 0 to 15 feet below sea level rise in our project area. Agriculture and land reclamation have caused significant subsidence, causing communities and agricultural fields to rely on levees and pumps to stay dry, and current pumping practices continue to exacerbate subsidence. Many districts don't have adequate funds in order to be able to inspect, maintain, or rehabilitate these levees, and they're all in various states of safety design standards, since some protect communities and others protect agriculture. Sea level rise and subsidence could worsen flood risks by 1, increasing pressure on the levees from rising sea level. Number 2, rising groundwater could increase the liquefaction potential during seismic events, which is the loss of soil strength if shaken long and hard enough. And number 3, by increasing the reliance on and cost of operating pumps, which are sensitive to flooding and power outages. A breach in levees could cause catastrophic loss of life, livelihoods, and assets for communities, businesses, and agriculture. And there could be substantial economic impacts for the region due to losses in visitation, recreation, agriculture, and gas extraction. Farmlands could also be ruined by salinization of soils through contact with the brackish water. And finally, if flooded, floodwaters could help mobilize some contaminants. The working group voted on the top adaptation action to model how sea level rise and sea level rise combined with major storms will affect levee stability and update the design and engineering standards accordingly. The last key planning issue is worsening water quality. Shown in this image is how sea level rise can contaminate well water with saline water because as the salt water rises, it pushes its cone of influence further inland. This means that groundwater could experience increasing salinity close to the shore, possibly affecting water supplies from wells. And sea level rise is likely to cause a worsening of water quality due to contaminant mobilization, as I mentioned earlier, and salinity increases from the tidally influenced bay reaching up into the delta. Surface water is used for drinking by many of the small communities on the Delta, as well as some East Bay residents and users of the Central Valley Project and State Water Project. This totals millions of users in total, and it's also used for many acres of farmland to irrigate. Additionally, increasingly saline water could cause corrosion of infrastructure that was not originally protected against salt water, such as septic tanks, landfills, wells, pumps, pipes, and water treatment facilities. Finally, habitats can also be affected by contamination mobilization and salinity changes. The working group voted on the top adaptation action to increase green infrastructure and low-impact development near the shore to increase freshwater infiltration and reduce saline groundwater. So in conclusion, some of the next steps ART will be taking is, number 1, finishing ADA accessibility and publishing the final report, hopefully in the next month or so. And number 2, developing a 2020 work plan for education and outreach in Contra Costa County on sea level rise to keep the momentum going and because agencies and folks in the county expressed their interest in ART continuing their work there. Finally, we have been and continue to share lessons learned from this project with DSC for your vulnerability assessment. And we will continue to engage with DSC on how we can both stay involved with Contra Costa County to advance their education, outreach, and adaptation planning efforts. At this time, I can take any questions.
Good.
Relationship with Contra Costa County and the Delta Protection Commission. How do you interact with those two entities? It's on Contra Costa County, but I don't know, with the overlapping authority of some kind there, it seems like. And the Delta Protection Commission, which I would assume there's some relationship there as well, since they have jurisdiction and some kind of joint jurisdiction over the same area.
In terms of Contra Costa County, Bcdc is a regional agency comprised of members, commissioners from all of the 9 Bay Area counties. So Contra Costa County is on Bcdc's commission, and they are within our jurisdiction, at least a portion of the county. Interestingly, this portion of the county is outside of Bcdc's jurisdiction, and so we're sort of working in an area that technically isn't under Bcdc's regulatory authority, but in respect to this type of work, which is really advisory planning, stakeholder development type of work, we can really plan where we want to. It's more stakeholder driven in nature. I might ask someone else to try to answer the question about Delta protection.
Based on the map, it looks like you wouldn't interact since they are focused on the primary zone of the delta.
Okay, thank you.
Missed that.
20, it would have been
Oscar?
28 agencies, right?
Oscar's not here.
Can you describe how the CZMA authority has helped you, and can you point to anything in particular that you've achieved because of that would not have been achieved without it?
So BCDC is one of the state's 3 coastal management agencies. With the Coastal Commission, the Coastal Conservancy, and BCDC, we comprise the California State Coastal Management Program. Through that, we receive funds from NOAA as the state's coastal management program, and we use those funds for a range of things. Involved a lot of our planning work comes from that source. In terms of our actual CZMA authority, it gives us the ability to review federal actions within both our jurisdictional areas and things that might have impact on the coastal zone. So we regularly review, projects like Army Corps projects, dredging projects, things of that nature within the Bay. Doing consistency review is a regular part of our permitting activities. Sometimes it works better than others. At the end of the day, it's not exactly the same as our regular kind of state level permitting authority, but we do work closely with the Corps, for example, on their sediment programs, on their dredging programs. I feel like that's a main area where we really interact and use our CZMA authority.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, I have a question.
Well, I have a question on, given what you just said and your slide about the vulnerability of the levees, top priority adaptation response. Will you, in implementing these top voted responses, have you begun to identify the implementers and funding sources and et cetera?
I'll answer that. So the art program is really, we're sort of separate from any of the authorities that BCDC has for permitting, any of the CZMA authority. So we try to put a firewall in between that so that we can work with the community to find just the kind of widest range of adaptation strategies, whether they are totally feasible or not. And then we don't have any of the implementing authority, so that's why Sam is going to continue to work with the county to do public outreach, education, get stakeholders on board. That's why we cultivate our working group, so that those are the people that hopefully will be the ones taking authority for implementation. So we get up to a certain point where we have a list, and then we have assigned some idea of who could be the implementing partners on that. But there's a lot of additional work that will be needed to understand the feasibility of all of these and to have an implementing partner, figure out how to fund it and all of that. So we're going to continue to work with the county to get a better handle on what an implementation plan would look like.
So in your working group, did the working group look at benefits and trade-offs, and I'm trying to get a handle on how things got to be top voted?
It was a pretty simple process, just involving the working group and posters of the 7 key planning issues and a list of adaptation solutions, and then they just sticker voted on the ones that they thought were the most important and the ones that they'd like to be a priority. We decided not to get into any of the evaluation criteria because doing the Western Contra Costa project, we found that the adaptation solutions weren't developed to a point where they were further enough along to really truly understand what the benefits and trade-offs were. So that would be something that we would do maybe at a more conceptual stage, because this was still very high level.
That's another question I had on the levees reclamation and subsidence. It's the top low-hanging fruit adaptation response. I'm fascinated that we'd have new microgrids of power systems. And Did the groups talk about what those would look like, or this was, given sea level rise, and I don't know, I don't have a sense of the magnitude of a microgrid in those areas.
Oh. The working group was interested in microgrids because of the power outages that have been happening recently, and a lot of the vulnerabilities that we found were from utilities stopping to work. So wastewater treatment plants, water treatment plants, traffic lights, hospitals. I mean, hospitals would have their own generation system, but schools and community centers would be without power. And it could lead to further flooding in the areas if the power is out because pumps wouldn't be able to run. So a lot of the folks in the working group thought that microgrids would be a great solution to implement sooner rather than later, just due to all the issues with PG&E.
Yeah, heightened awareness. Well, thank you. Are there any other questions?
I have a couple of questions. This is very helpful. I mean, BCDC's Adapting to Rising Tides and the work that you've done, I think, really served as an inspiration for the council venturing down the path of doing a climate change vulnerability assessment in the first place. Although we're a little bit further behind, we're still developing the vulnerability assessment itself, which will lead to the assumptions that then can factor into these adaptation discussions. So I'm very interested in the working groups and how you selected people for the working group, and whether building off Chair Tatayan's questions, whether the people in the working group are going to be people who are implementing or have influence over the implementation of these adaptation solutions. I think we're starting from a point where we want to learn from your successes, but also potentially, what you may see to be things that could be improved upon, so that at the end of the day, when we're developing an adaptation strategy, that it gets implemented and that there's local will and agreement that that's the type of tools and strategies that they need and that they have buy-in for.
So we had a good relationship with Contra Costa County because we'd already worked with them previously. So we worked with them to really identify who the key stakeholders in the East Contra Costa would be, and we also worked with Delta Stewardship Council to identify stakeholders. So we had a fairly large mailing list, and it was kind of the same 20 people who showed up every time. So it's a challenge to get all of the right people who would need to have implementing authority in the room consistently at the same time. And in terms of, I think the hardest leap is, you have a list of adaptation strategies. Now everyone wants to sort of it's not my hot potato. But we did at the end, and UC Berkeley, a team of students from UC Berkeley had done a report on the West Contra Costa art project with some suggestions for how to get closer to implementation. And we had a discussion about that at our last working group meeting. And that's one of the things that we're sort of putting a proposal together, is what sort of governance structure would be needed at the county level. I think the county is interested in taking some level of leadership around this. And we've talked about, what would a working group look like? Is there an existing working group that would be suitable? We are sharing with them the countywide governance changes that San Mateo County made. They created a new county department that is tasked with sea level rise adaptation. So we're exploring a lot of those options right now. But it is a challenge to, get everyone really ready to dive into the really hard work. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sam. Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was helpful for me to sit through, and Chair Tatayan was there as well, as we did this kickoff for our stakeholder group for the adaptation strategy, and really just sitting and talking with local planners about what kind of requirements are you under currently to plan for sea level rise and other climate change impacts, and how can what we're doing here at the council provide you with that kind of guidance or technical information, so that we're really meeting local needs rather than just coming in and saying, well, here's the other things that we think you should also do in addition to these requirements.
Yeah, and that's why our working group was so critical, is because we don't have land use authority. The county has some, but there are obviously land use authority resides locally. So the projects will have to be implemented at various levels that are not us.
Any other questions? Are there any public comments on this item?
I think staff are going to quickly wrap up with the
Okay.
next steps related to our work.
Exactly. We actually had one more slide before comments, if we can get and Kaylee, do you want to go ahead and talk about kind of the work we're doing, again, with jointly the council and BCDC on both the vulnerability assessment as well as and how it correlates with the work BCDC is doing?
Yeah, so the council continues to work with BCDC on our vulnerability assessment through several ways. We mentioned that the hydrodynamic modeling was really influential in how we selected ours for our climate change project. We are modeling our disadvantaged community outreach and assessment on the ART process, which will increase the equitability of our study. And we also will continue to receive participation from BCDC in our technical working group and stakeholder group. And we're also continuing our objectives in the MOU through a review of the policies of the Sassoon Marsh Plan. And so we'll be meeting with stakeholders in Sassoon Marsh in February to begin this comprehensive review. And we anticipate that sea level rise, climate change, and the Delta Plan policies may influence how that plan is updated. Later this year, we'll also collaborate on building adaptation responses that are more cohesive between the Delta and the Bay as we move forward. So collaboration on these and future projects will result in improved management, coordination, and climate change preparation for the entire San Francisco Bay Delta. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kaylee. And thank you for being here and taking the time to share your learnings and your findings.
No, thank you for having us.
And so are there any public comments in general? Oh, OSHA?
Local agencies of the North Delta, thank you for your presentation. I think what sounds like, all of this work is very relevant to the things we're looking at every day in the Delta. One thing I would say that could be integrated maybe more into the Chapter 4 amendments is this concept of using the modeling that shows how sea level rise attenuates as you move away from the sea, I think is really important, and we have to think about that with respect to the water quality issues as well, which there's also some modeling available on that. I think it was in 2014, I could give anyone the study that wanted, but there was, Army Corps of Engineers did a study that was a 3D model that tried to look at both of those issues that kind of came up with some similar results as what they're showing on the slide here with the attenuation as you move away from the Golden Gate. And so it helps us with planning, and I would say that that kind of needs to get integrated in with Delta levy investment, as well as what we're trying to do with ecosystem restoration, because I know for public information and raising public awareness, there's a lot of kind of broad brush stuff that goes on, and there's cool tools on the internet you can go on and you can see how, oh, Elk Grove will be flooding in 50 years and you should care a lot, and I totally agree with raising awareness, but we need to be developing some more granular tools to actually do the planning for the best we can for what would actually occur. And it doesn't help us a lot if we, ignore the variation and the variability of sea level rise across a complicated landscape, especially as you get farther and farther into the Delta. So thanks for coming.
Great. Thank you, OSHA. Any other public comments? Okay, well, thank you again. And if there are no other comments or questions from the council, I think we are ready to adjourn the meeting. Next meeting will be February 27 at Park Tower Plaza Conference Room. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.